Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Vinny Makes the Hall of Fame Case for. And I'm Kirk Buckner. I run NotInHallOfFame.com and all the other stuff that I do. The Fictitious Athlete Hall of Fame, the Fictitious Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the United States Athletics Hall of Fame, which Vinny Lospinuso is a part of. So I'm really happy to do this show with him. And we are traveling to the tundra of Minnesota, where we're looking at Jim Marshall.
Yes. Jim Marshall, one of the most well-known players of the early Super Bowl days, I would argue. Also one of the most iconic defensive players in NFL history, period, in many ways, in my opinion.
And yeah, Marshall is like everything you said. When you think of an iconic figure in Skull Country, like what I did there?
Mm-hmm. Skull Country, yep, Minnesota. He
There you
was a
go.
Viking. Like, he legit was a Viking, in my opinion.
There's, well, from, was it 1960 to 1979? He's the most interesting player for me. And before we went on, he's the guy I like the most and dislike the most in a weird way, only because as somebody who I respect longevity, but at the same time, I don't always reward longevity. I love big eras of dynamic play. Marshall wasn't that guy. Jim Marshall was a consistent player for a long, long period of time. Jim Marshall was only twice a Pro Bowler, yet when you think of Minnesota defense, you can't not include Jim Marshall.
I mean, you would look at Alan Page and Carl Eller, and they would not have the legendary careers they have if not for Jim Marshall being the leader of the band. I mean, Tarkenton said it, Krause has said it, Page and Eller have all said it. Ron Yari has said it before. Mick Tingelhoff has said it. Hell, even if you looked at Bud Grant, he called Jim Marshall the focal point of those defenses. And as much as people may disagree with him, he's not wrong. He called him the greatest Minnesota Viking of all time.
Really?
And that's not just because Bud Grant didn't just say that for anyone. He wasn't someone who was just lying because he's close with Jim Marshall. Jim Marshall is not Jim Marshall in terms of what Bud Grant said. He did not speak this highly of just anyone. He said, "Coach, who is your best football player?" And he said, "Well, as a coach, you never usually go there. But what do I think about Jim Marshall?" And this is what he says. He was a special football player, and he was an even more special man. And if it was not for Jim Marshall, I would not be here today. I love Jim Marshall.
Okay.
So you have that from purely the Vikings side.
Mm-hmm.
You look at his career, the ultimate Iron Man, in my opinion. There are times when the man was sick, had broken bones. He played regardless. This man would go in like big expeditions where some people would die, and he would still be fine. Like he legit was a real Viking warrior. This man, he had more than nine. He had more 9 lives than a cat. This guy.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he is such a fun player to just mention, just fun person to speak about. And when his career was over, they actually burned and disposed of every single game that could have been game worn Jim Marshall jersey that wasn't worn yet, because they didn't want anyone else to wear that number again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like that tells you his importance to the Vikings. Now, obviously, yes, but we're not talking about the Ring of Honor here. We're talking about the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Mhm.
And we finally got a Viking from the seniors in McTinglehoff, the center. Jim Marshall, though, has always been the more popular guy. And the issue with him is he does not have as many Pro Bowls. He only has second team All Pros, but he was a part of two. PFR has him in two different All Decade teams. Not many players can say they're part of two All Decade teams. PFR has, Brett Favre's been on a couple, and Jim Marshall as a defensive end has been on two.
Right.
1960s and 1970s, he's part of the second team All 60s and 70s. Now, granted, neither time he was first team. I'll give you that. However, the fact of the matter is he was on two all-decade teams regardless. And regardless of whether it's first or second team, he was still on two different all-decade teams. And that's a pretty incredible feat to say.
I think what I'm looking at, again, I'm going to go back to the whole compiling. 135 and a half sacks, unofficial. But Pro Football Reference, I pretty much believe what they say because they're awesome.
Yeah, they're pretty legit.
Yeah, for sure. Which is good. It's not necessarily upper tier. The against for me directly, obviously, was Jim Marshall ever a top three defensive end in any year? And probably not.
The,
Was
the issue is the issue though is because he played with Elwer and Page,
sure,
and that's
sure,
gonna
but to that point, was he like 4 to 6 for a long period of those years? And the answer is
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, he was. He
And
was he was definitely a top five or at worst fringe top five guy for like
yeah,
20 straight years. And granted, he didn't have any Pro Bowls in the 70s, but that's also because put because a lot of it kind of less focus on him and was more focused on how they use Eller and Page. But Marshall was very much a huge part of those teams in many ways. The two reasons to why it's hurt Marshalls besides the awards is they talk about the wrong way run. I never really think of the wrong way run because the Vikings won that game, but the main issue is because in the Super Bowls that they went to, the four Super Bowls the Vikings lost, Marshall didn't play that good in them. And if they were to win any of those games, I'm pretty sure he would have been in right
that
now. And
I, I'm glad you brought that up, Vin, because that was something that I had a note here to ask you. If Minnesota wins one of those, and for those unaware, Minnesota is essentially the Bills of the 70s. They went
yes,
to not four straight, but they went to four Super Bowls, failed in all.
they went to 3 and 4 years, and they also had the one with Joe Cap as their quarterback.
Joe Cap always makes me think of that viral video with Angelo Mosca. But anyway, uh, moving moving on. If Minnesota wins one of them, and we say Jim Marshall Super Bowl champion, are we even having this debate?
I think he'd be in already. Like he reminds me in many ways of Ken Riley, except as a lineman, and also a bit of Clay Matthews. Ken Riley's in, and a big reason why I wanted Ken Riley in is because he didn't have any Pro Bowls. However, the number of interceptions he had was historically high. Jim Marshall was a big reason why I wanted to get Ken Riley in the Hall of Fame. Now, granted, in terms of sacks numbers, it's not as high. However, in terms of approximate value, he is 29th all time in terms of total approximate value. Everyone
Mhm.
above him that that is eligible for the Hall of Fame
Is in.
is in already, except for Jim Marshall. The next guy below him is Ken Anderson, and he's much further down. So that's pretty huge. The fact that Jim Marshall is that highly rated in terms of AV. Now, granted, he played a long time, but still, that's pretty high as a defensive end, being 29th all time of
Yeah.
any single player. That's pretty historically high.
And
Not
if I,
not even
I
hmm?
was going to say, if I could, with approximate value, obviously it's skewed towards quarterbacks. It doesn't
Yes.
matter to me that Jim Marshall played 20 years. That's more impressive to me than Ken Anderson's.
Oh, absolutely. Now, granted, when it's weighted, Anderson's a bit higher, but even then, Marshall being a defensive end, that's 29th. You look at the linemen that are like in that high range. You have, Reggie White's there, obviously. You have Bruce Matthews, offensive lineman, Junior Seau, Alan Page, Derek Brooks, Lawrence Taylor, Rod Woodson, who was a defensive back. But so Julius Peppers, Anthony Munoz, Carl Eller, his teammate, Randall McDaniel, another Viking, and Ronnie Lott. Just below him is Merlin Olsen. You have below him, you have Deion Sanders. Below him, you have Charles Woodson. Paul Krause is below him. Bobby Wagner is below him. Like Jim Marshall is pretty historically high for defensive players, period.
Mhm. Then
Like that alone. Ken Anderson, if you Ken Anderson's ranked 48. Jim Marshall is ranked 29.
I'm trying to remember, was Marshall one of the semifinalists for the seniors this year? I can't
He was
recall.
a semifinalist the last 2 years, 2023 and 2024. And mind you, this is for a seniors committee that does not have has only 12 people and none of them represent Minnesota. So I don't see him making it with this current list because of just there's no one there. But the fact that there's no Vikings representative and he's still there, that's pretty impressive, especially when you consider how, Harvey Martin is someone that people consider. Greenwood's been a finalist in the past. Boy Bacon and Al Baker also get consideration. But yet Jim Marshall is the one that's above them in terms of momentum at the moment without anyone from Minnesota on there. I don't know if when he's gonna be in the 12. I mean, I don't know how likely it is with Mark Craig not on there, but still, like, regardless of what people may think about Marshall, he has the most momentum out of other defensive ends at the moment.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
I
and
mean, and I guess like I told you before, it's like Marshall is. I debate. It's my always internal debate: the compiler versus the dominator. Like I was huge on Terrell Davis, for his dominating years, and I will go to the bat for that. I also then love somebody who can stay effective and competent and a top 10 guy forever.
the way I see it, in terms of the way I always look at things, why does it have to be a dichotomy? I've never believed in that. In the same way that I was a huge, 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 huge Ken Riley guy, I was also a pretty big Bobby Dillon guy, despite only playing 8 years, because people always debate, do you prefer compilation or short but strong? I don't. Why does that have to be a debate between the two? I think both are deserving. Like
Well, I'm
in
not
this,
saying that they both aren't. I'm just saying for me personally,
yeah, I get it.
that's my
Like,
internal struggle.
yeah,
And
and I get it completely.
yeah,
It's a case that people have, and it's a deserving one to mention. But at the same time, when you have, Clay Matthews Jr., who in my opinion is like a Jim Marshall, getting attention. He's been a finalist. Jen has made a big reason as why that happened. And Ken Riley is sort of similar. Riley, in many ways, they're a bit different, but in many ways, he's like a cornerback version of Jim Marshall in terms of very, very long sustained excellence, but way under the radar and not much awards. Now, granted, he only had one Super Bowl appearance, and his only first team All Pro was his final year.
no, I
Would
hear
you
what you're
consider
saying.
Marshall to be like Ken Riley in a sense, or like how would you describe him?
I have him higher than Ken Riley personally.
So do
Jim,
I.
yeah. Uh, I think also too. I mean, Minnesota never let him go. That tells me a lot.
He was the Vikings. Like I
Right.
know Alan Page was a better player. I know Carl Eller was a better player. I know Paul Krause was a better player. But if you look at how important Jim Marshall was, Eller would not be the player he was if it was not for Jim Marshall. Page would have not been the player he was for Jim without Jim Marshall. And I can guarantee you, Bud Grant, if he was alive today, would tell you straight up, I would not be in the Hall of Fame if it was not for Jim Marshall. He wouldn't say that
Yeah.
for Alan Page. He wouldn't say that for Carl Eller. He wouldn't even say that for Fran Tarkenton if his life depended on it. He would say that Jim, Mr. Jim Marshall is where he is. I mean,
Mhm.
Jim Marshall needs to be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
He's 86 years old. Get him in while he's still alive. It's just like Billy Howden, Roman Gabriel. Like when Jim Marshall dies and he's done the Hall of Fame, I'm gonna feel the same way as I did when Ken Riley died before he made it, and when Maxie Bond died or when Eddie Metter died,
Mhm.
I'd be shame on you because this guy was so deserving and so demanded for so long. Yet you preferred to just keep debating amongst yourselves as opposed to just finally just getting ripping off the band-aid off finally. And I get the struggle, but Jim Marshall's so deserving. He's my most wanted Viking. He's my most wanted defensive end not in the Hall of Fame. And I don't say that lightly. He is
Oh,
so
I
deserving. It's
know.
not even.
I know when you say that for any position, I know how serious that means. All right,
Yeah,
cool.
like I would say in terms of 60s guys too, like just like I would probably go on record and saying in terms of guys from the 60s on the defensive side, there's probably no one I want more than Jim Marshall. And then that's in 70s too. Yeah, that's how badly I want Jim Marshall. When I was in Canton, I spoke with Carl Eller and Ronald McDaniel. They were actually both there, and they both said, we're working on Jim Marshall. That's who we want." And Carl Eller told me, "Jim's been a brother for me. No one wants to see him make the Hall of Fame more than me."
Uh, I can't think of a better endorsement.
Great man. He's such a wise man, Carl Eller was still in his 80s coming to this event and just it's incredible. It's like you got to go to Canton one time. It was magical.
I told you I'm going with you this year.
Yeah. My I also met my friend Zach over there. He's from Canton. He's not into sports though.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, he's a cool dude though. He's not into sports, but he's a big Braves fan. So yeah, we kind of have that Atlanta connection, even though he's a bit different.
Sounds good, man. All
Yeah.
right. Well, we'll do some shows from Canton for sure. Well,
Oh
Vin,
yeah.
thanks so much. This has been great. Look for more shows that Vinny does, where Vinny makes various Hall of Fame cases for. It's not always football,
Mhm.
and there's so many other things going on here in the Bucknerverse, here at NotInHallOfFame.com. Wherever you are, wherever you may be, make it a great day because it doesn't come again.
You guys.